So I'd like to extend our thank you to all our delegates today. So thank you very much for joining this happy hour, which we're really looking forward to, because it's a very important theme of the theme of social inclusion of older people from diverse backgrounds in the care environments. So to discuss this theme today, we've invited three excellent speakers and friends of the Housing Lin. So first on the agenda is Paul Willis, who is an associate professor in social work and social gerontology in the School for Policy Studies at the University of Bristol. So he's a researcher in adult social care and aging, and his current research interests include older men's experience of loneliness and social isolation, sexuality, care and aging, trans aging and gender identity, and also inclusive housing and care provision for diverse groups of older people. So Paul is going to talk about the diversity in care environments research study, which you've probably heard of as a member of the Housing Lin. So this study concluded in January this year, and it was a 2.5-year research study, which was conducted in housing with care and support schemes in England and Wales, and explored the social inclusion of older people from socially diverse backgrounds living in these settings. So Paul is going to highlight some of the key findings from the DICE study, and we'll also introduce the resultant learning resource, which is aimed at increasing awareness and confidence in supporting inclusion and diversity within housing schemes. But I'll let Paul tell you a bit more about the research in a minute. Also joining us today is Dr. Manik Gopinath from the Open University and Bashir Uddin from Bangla Housing Association, who are both members of the newly launched Bari, Amar Jibon, which stands for My Home, My Life in Bangla, and is a joint research project funded by the Dunhill Medical Trust and conducted by the Open University Bangla Housing Association in collaboration with the Housing Lin. So Manik and Bashir will provide us with an overview and background information to this pioneering 36 months research project on the housing and care needs of the Bangladeshi elders community in East London boroughs of Hackney, Newham and Tower Hamlets. Right, so without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Paul. So enjoy the session, everybody. And as Sally mentioned, please remember to post questions in the Q&A box, so that will make for a great conversation at the end of this session. Thank you very much. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Jerome, and a big thank you to yourself and Sally and Housing Lin for inviting us to speak today. It's really good to be here and to join my co-presenters in talking to this topic about diversity in housing and care environments for older people. I've got a bit of a silly cough today, so hopefully that won't get in the way, but I just thought I kind of forewarn people about that. So if I do stop and mute myself, please forgive me. Hopefully it won't interrupt too much. Okay, so as Jerome's already eloquently pointed out, this presentation is about the DICE study, which was fundamentally looking at how housing with care and support in England and Wales supports and promotes socially inclusive practices for diverse groups of older people. So on the left there, you can see the research team. We are based across the School for Policy Studies at the University of Bristol, with our colleague Brian Beach, who's based at the Institute of Epidemiology and Health at UCL, and with Jeremy Porteous at Housing Lin. And the project was also conducted in collaboration with the International Longevity Centre UK. And we were funded over the 3 years by the Economic and Social Research Council. So a little bit of background to the study and the project. We know that we are living with an ageing population, and that the number of older people who are currently living in housing with care and support schemes is growing and expected to continue to rise over the coming decades. So in this particular study, we wanted to examine and identify more closely how housing providers mainstream housing providers are currently working to promote inclusive environments across different types of schemes. So when we talk about housing with care and support, we were looking at extra care schemes, independent living schemes, supported living schemes, and some schemes that are formerly known as, or currently known as, sheltered living or sheltered housing. And the common factor here was that all of these different types of schemes provided some kind of care for residents who needed that additional care and support in relation to social care needs. So we want to explore in this study the social inclusion of residents across these schemes in England and Wales. And we were particularly interested in how residents from social minority groups were included within these environments. So when we talk about social minority groups, we're focusing on older people, 60 plus years of age, who identify with some of the following social characteristics that are sometimes subject to marginalisation or discrimination. So in our study, this included people with physical and learning disabilities, people identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans, people identifying with Black and minority ethnic groups, and who may have also identified with minority religious groups. So today I'm going to walk you through a little bit more about the study. I will highlight some of the key findings just briefly, mainly because we have an excellent report that's been produced by the International Longevity Centre, which highlights in much more depth and detail the key findings from the study. And also because I want to spend the latter part of today's presentation talking about some of the resources that we've created based on the findings from this study, and to showcase some of that work. So how did we do the research? It was a mixed method study. So we used these 3 different methods to focus on social inclusion practices across different types of schemes. We had a hard copy questionnaire, which was self-completed by residents from 95 schemes, and we had 741 of those questionnaires returned to us, which is around about a 23.6% response rate from the schemes that responded. And then we had interviews. We had semi-structured interviews with staff across 8 housing schemes, with residents across 8 housing schemes. And that was 51 interviews, including 12 follow-up during the first year of the pandemic, 2020. And we also interviewed stakeholders, and these were key people who were involved in commissioning around housing at a local level, policy making and policy informing, and advocacy work for older people and housing more broadly. And we also had some longitudinal interviews, and these were a series of interviews over an 18-month period with residents who specifically identified with some of the minority groups I mentioned before. So we had 21 residents took part in at least one interview, 4 people who agreed to be interviewed twice, and 14 people who took part in all 3 interviews. And it probably comes as no surprise that we had to adapt from in-person interviews to remote interviews from April 2020 onwards, when the pandemic took hold. So first of all, let me just touch on some of the key findings from the study. What did we learn? Well, our residents told us that there was general agreement that schemes offer positive social opportunities, so positive opportunities to socialise with other residents, but there was some scope to improve and make it less challenging or uncomfortable to participate. And indeed, residents with disabilities, physical disabilities in particular, highlighted numerous barriers to getting involved in social activities and opportunities that were offered as part of their scheme. We also learned from our survey study, from our survey element of the study, that housing with care residents appeared to have lower average scores for loneliness compared to older adults living in the community. And this was based on us comparing our survey findings with findings from the ELSA study, which stands for English Longitudinal Study of Aging, in particular wave 9 of this study, which has been conducted across multiple waves over the years. We learned that residents are active contributors to their communities, and this was particularly tangible during the pandemic lockdowns in 2020, where residents played a key role in supporting other residents with their day-to-day living and keeping in touch with other people. We also found out that there were pockets of isolation among residents identifying with social minority groups. So while we had these lower average scores for loneliness compared to older adults living broadly in the community, isolation was still a problem for residents who identified with social minority groups. So when we look at how inclusive housing with care was for people belonging to minority groups. Most residents from social minority groups felt valued and they felt included, but they often anticipated or had experienced discrimination. Sometimes this was discrimination within the scheme, for example, witnessing racist or homophobic comments, or it might have been based on lifetime experiences of discrimination within external communities. So you can see here a quote from one participant who's getting rather annoyed with other residents who are making very homophobic comments and feeling very disappointed about some of other people's attitudes. So we got a sense that residents from minority groups felt more isolated and generally looked more outward for their social connections. So looked to families and friends who lived outside of the scheme as key social ties, along with groups that often represented and reflected their own identities that were important to them. We also found evidence of what we've called boundary setting within schemes. This is where residents put up boundaries or barriers based on differences in sexuality, gender identity, and ethnicity. So for example, using racist and outdated language in conversations, expressing homophobic views in conversations that are overheard by others, or one incident where a participant, a trans-identifying participant, found leaflets in their laundry area that had anti-trans sentiment as part of those leaflets. So these very kind of simple but overt acts immediately set up boundaries between residents and made residents who belong to minority groups feel othered, separated, and to a certain extent excluded from general life within schemes. And we found this othering also translated over to residents with dementia and learning disabilities. And this is where we saw that interaction between ageism and disableism and cognitivism on the basis of dementia and impairments in cognition. We saw that intersection come to life where we actually heard firsthand from residents taking part in the study, expressing openly views about that people with dementia don't belong here and don't belong in extra care schemes, and they belong in a nursing home, and that this wasn't the place for them. We also learned a lot about the social significance of the external spaces across schemes, the social significance for facilitating regular, meaningful interaction between residents and supporting ongoing social connections. And this was even more apparent during the 2020 lockdowns and those first periods of lockdown and social isolation. So external spaces such as balconies and garden patios that a lot of residents had access to or were attached to their individual apartments were really key spaces for being able to safely socialize with others and maintain those social connections. And we also learned more importantly about the importance of green spaces for connecting residents to the natural environment and also providing important spaces of social interaction on an ongoing basis. So that's just a very quick Cook's tour of some of the key findings of the study. There are lots of other key findings that emerged through this study. I was just going to put in the Q&A box, I'm not sure if I can actually, a link to the ILC report. Okay, I'm not going to worry about that now.
Yeah, I'm sure we can put it in Sally can put it in the chat box in a minute.
Great, thanks, Jerome. Thanks, Sally. That's great. But I wanted to talk more about some of the resources that we've created based on these key findings. First of all, we worked with a radio producer to produce a series of podcasts about the themes of social inclusion, housing, and the experiences of older people from socially diverse backgrounds. So we worked with 5 residents to create a podcast, 1 podcast per contributor. These are 5 residents who are 60 years and over and are currently living in a housing with care scheme across Southwest England and South Wales. And across the 5 contributors, their lives and their stories reflect differences across sexuality, gender and gender identity, disability and ethnic background. These podcasts also highlight really key intersections, particularly around the intersection between disability and aging and the additional barriers and concerns that generates for older residents more broadly, but in particular, some of the challenges and barriers it generates feeling integrated and included in the scheme where they lived. And we also created a 6th About the Study podcast, which goes into more depth about what the DICE study is all about. All of these podcasts are hosted on the Housing Lin website, a dedicated microsite where we've located all of these resources in one place. So I want to share with you today the first few minutes of episode 4. This is Sasha's story. So Sasha is a woman in her late 60s. Sasha lives alone. Sasha identifies as Jewish and lesbian. And Sasha viewed herself as a minority amongst other residents. And this is the basis of her disability and her mental health, as well as her sexuality as a lesbian. And recently, when I say recently, sorry, when we, around about the time we interviewed and recorded Sasha's story, Sasha had stopped attending scheme outdoor activities due to some of the racist views that she'd witnessed expressed by other residents. So I'm going to stop sharing and Sally's going to play the first few minutes of Sasha's story.
DICE, a series of 6 podcasts about social inclusion, housing, and the experiences of older people from socially diverse backgrounds. This is part 4, Sasha's story, a woman who identifies as lesbian and Jewish.
I feel comfortable here. I feel quite safe. I feel very relaxed about residing here. It has become home, you know.
Hello, meet Sasha, who lives in a 1-bedroom flat in a small retirement village, itself within the heart of a rural village in the home counties. Sasha's a 69-year-old white woman who identifies as lesbian and Jewish. Brought up in Germany, she's been living in the UK since the 1980s. Her story is one of 5 insights into the lives of older people as seen through the lens of their housing experiences. They're all available as podcasts on this website. Sasha and the other contributors have taken part in DICE, a University of Bristol study which stands for Diversity in Care Environments. My name's Dr. Paul Willis and I've led the DICE research project with a number of colleagues. As a lecturer in social work at the University of Bristol, I study housing and care support for older people, looking at things like ageing, the experience of loneliness and social inclusion. I'm interested, for example, in how sexuality and ageing are experienced by older people in the context of their housing and longer-term care. I was pleased to meet Sasha and to hear her story because in the 1990s, she herself was a manager of a housing scheme for older people. So what was that like for her, I wondered?
Oh my God, do you want me to go there? Very demanding because it was residential. You had to live on site. So it's almost like being on duty 24/7. Very demanding. People seem to confuse being the manager with being a servant, especially the ones who were owner-occupiers. It was a good adding to my learning curve of people's psychology.
So now that the tables are turned and Sasha has been a resident at her scheme for 5 years, what's that like for her?
Sometimes inadvertently have my manager hat on and I think the manager should be doing this and should be doing... And if I had done this or behaved in this way, I would have been fired on the spot. But it doesn't apply.
Sasha's flat is part of a complex of self-contained 1- and 2-bedroom apartments and bungalows, surrounded by beautiful, well-maintained outdoor communal gardens. However, she has emphysema and likes to keep herself to herself. During the first 16 months of the pandemic, she didn't leave her flat once.
I went out a couple of weeks ago because I desperately needed a passport picture for my settlement application, and that was the first time since the first lockdown began. But I have to be fair. It's probably easier for me than for a lot of other people to stay in seclusion, because I have certain mental health issues like agoraphobia, anxiety attacks, and depression. So I'm used to being by myself. So to me, it wasn't that much of an issue, really.
Thank you, Sally. I'm just going to return to my slide. There we go. Okay, so that was Sasha, and hopefully people feel motivated to go and listen to the rest of Sasha's story. Her story is fascinating. It's a very unique story, but equally we can start to see some very transferable themes that can be pulled out and applied to a whole range of different residents. So for example, Sasha touched on there about the importance of her housing scheme being a safe, comfortable environment and what that meant for her. Her story also highlights the importance of adopting a life course perspective where we recognize the identities and groups and communities that have been important for Sasha throughout her life and how they feature in her current day-to-day life now. So later on in the podcast, Sasha goes on to talk about what it means to identify as Jewish, her activism as a feminist and within queer and LGBT communities in the 80s and 90s. And it also highlights the importance of recognizing the skills and knowledge that residents bring to schemes. So in relation to Sasha, we learned a little bit there about her former experiences as a housing manager and how that filtered her views about current staff practices within the scheme. Her story also highlights the significant impact of social isolation, both in relation to disability, emphysema, and concerns about her health and well-being, and also in relation to the impact of the pandemic and those first 18 months of lockdown. And later on, Sasha elaborates on the importance of digital connections. So connected to that theme of isolation and having to self-isolate at home, Sasha elaborates on how the internet provides such an important platform for her to be able to connect to groups and communities online that matter to her and that reflect her identity, perhaps in ways that are not reflected by other residents within the scheme where she lives. So that's just a flavor of one of the podcasts, one of the 5 contributors to this story, to these stories, and we're very grateful to all 5 residents for taking part and sharing their story. On the back of the podcast, we've created a learning resource. This is aimed at scheme managers and housing staff and accompanies the podcasts. It's been written around each podcast. So the aim of the learning resource is to increase awareness of social difference and diversity amongst older residents, to illustrate different forms of discrimination and inequality experienced by residents on the basis of social minority identities, and to start to pull out what does this mean in terms of how we can best support people in the here and now within these housing schemes, and to hopefully trigger and facilitate critical and practical thinking about the ways in which staff and managers of schemes can promote socially inclusive environments at both the individual resident level and across the scheme-based level. So you'll see here on the right, we've got a picture of the SoundCloud link where people can click on to listen to Sasha's story. We've got the option to download the transcript if that works better for people engaging with this. And then we have key learning questions that build on or follow on from Sasha's story. So a couple of key questions there about how can staff support residents to maintain their individuality and their sense of self when their life is restricted by poor health or disability? What role does digital technology play in supporting residents to maintain their independence? And how does your organisation celebrate or recognise the different cultural, spiritual and social beliefs of residents? So these questions invite housing staff and managers to reflect on what is this story and some of the themes in this story mean for my day-to-day practice, and what would this look like if I was supporting a similar resident or a resident from a similar social group within my scheme. We've also included within the learning resource short vignettes. These are short vignettes that represent other residents, other identities that aren't necessarily reflected within the podcasts. And these were short vignettes we wrote to inform part of our interviews. So we use these vignettes when we talked to residents and when we talked to staff within housing schemes to be able to help initiate conversation about what it might be like to support people from different backgrounds and with diverse characteristics. So per podcast contributor, we've created key discussion questions. We highlight key legislation and policy, the Equality Act being a significant piece of legislation in this particular topic. And we summarize some of the key learning points, or what we perceive as the key learning points that hopefully provide an informative platform for staff and managers engaging with this resource. And we suggest that the resource and the podcasts can be used in the following ways. It might be used as part of staff recruitment activities. Please excuse my typo error there. And it might be used, for example, with recruitment activities at interview level, where people are invited to read one of the vignettes and respond, and be used as a way of assessing potential staff members or new recruits' values and principles. It can be incorporated as part of training for staff on diversity and equality. It might be used in terms of individual learning or incorporated as part of online modular learning, which you know is already a prominent feature across a lot of housing and care providers. Or they might be used as a basis for small group discussion. And this could be a simple exercise, such as a 1-hour discussion group, where a small group of staff and their manager might listen to one of the podcasts together and then have a broader discussion about what this might mean for them and their day-to-day practice. And they could also be used as a really important conversation starter of residents. Some of those podcasts and vignettes might initiate bigger discussions about how can we support a more inclusive neighbourhood? What does it mean to be a good neighbour? How can we support neighbours around us, particularly if our neighbours reflect different characteristics and have very different life experiences to our own? So, the Housing Link website, the micro website, hosts the learning resource, the podcasts, and the ILC report about the DICE study and the key findings. And it also contains a short About the DICE study film, which we created as another medium to highlight some of the key learning from this project. We've also recently published a blog through Housing Lin and through Cache, which is a key housing research network and collaboration, which highlights in more depth some of our findings about loneliness and isolation. And I would be really interested to hear from people currently working in housing schemes and organisations supporting housing for older people about how we might look at piloting and testing some of these resources with groups of staff and within managers, as we see that as the next step in terms of figuring out how we might develop and refine these resources to really make a good impact. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Paul, for this great presentation on the DICE project. So I would really tell everybody to go and visit those web pages. There's some great podcasts that Paul introduced. It's really worth a listen. So I believe Sally has already shared with you the URL in the chat box. So that's great, it's all there. If anybody is also interested in other resources around combating loneliness and reducing isolation, I would also advise you to visit the topic page on our website, which Sally is going to share in a minute, I'm sure. And yeah, thank you for the people who've posted some questions to start with. So we will answer these questions at the end of the session after Manik and Bashir's presentation. But thank you very much. Great. So we're now going to move on to the next presentation. So from Manik and Bashir. So I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to to our two speakers. So Dr. Manik Gonipat is a lecturer in aging in the School of Health and Wellbeing and Social Care at the Open University. She has a sustained interest in understanding and unpacking first the intersection of aging, place and well-being, and secondly, intimate and family ties of older adults paying attention both to the diversity of aging and diverse environments of aging. Also joining Manik for the presentation is Bashir Uddin, who's the Chief Executive of Bangla Housing Association, which is based in Hackney in East London. And Bashir has been working in social housing for over 36 years and has been the CEO of Bangla Housing Association for over 18 years. So Manik and Bashir are going to provide us with an overview and background information to the exciting Amar Jibon project, which is a pioneering 36 months long research on the housing and care needs of the Bangladeshi elders in East London. Right, so over to you, Manik and Bashir. You're muted, Manik.
Thank you. That was classic Zoom. Thank you, Jerome, so much for the introductions. Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Manik Gopinath from the Open University, and I have Bashir here with me today from Bangla Housing Association, one of our project partners. We are going to talk briefly about what we are going to do. Unlike Paul's presentation, which is about the project as it has come and got findings to it, we are just beginning this project at the moment. So without further delay, I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. So what is this research about? As Jerome mentioned, My Home, My Life in Bengali is Amar Bari, Amar Jibon. And what we are doing is we are going to be listening to and hearing from the older Bangladeshi community in East London boroughs of Tow Hamlets, Hackney and Newham about their experiences of home, housing and neighborhood, how it impacts their well-being. Now, it is no surprise to anyone who has joined us today that by ethnicity, one of the groups that is most impacted by the entrenched housing and health inequalities is Bangladeshi households. They are more likely to live in non-decent housing compared to white households, and they are only second to mixed race and Black African households. As well as, interestingly, Bangladeshi households are the dominant tenure for them is to be in social housing and as private renters. So whilst we all know these headlines now, and given that housing and health are so intricately connected and shape each other, our project really wants to go to people and really find out what are their lived experiences, because to our knowledge, we do not know. We know the headlines of what it is, but we do not know how people experience it. We are also keen to know what factors influence this and why people are experiencing housing deprivation that also then impacts health. At the same time, we are interested in also knowing what are people's expectations around living and especially aging amongst these Bangladeshi older communities of men and women, and what are their aspirations? You know, how do people envisage living in when they have housing issues of cannot take the steps or cannot move from one room to the other? What are people doing in their daily lives? How are they moving, and where are they moving? Is sheltered housing an option? Are care homes an option? So we do not know how that is happening within the community. As well as we also know that Bangladeshi households, just like many other ethnic households, are likely to be having multiple generations living together. And this idea of housing decisions and how these are made has led us to also then think about involving families in this study. So whilst we are going to be majority talking to around 80 Bangladeshi older men and women, we are also going to be interviewing at least 10 family members who are, or 10 families rather, sorry, who are living multi-generationally, just to understand what the dynamics are, as well as what is the aspiration for living together in multi-generational households. At the same time, we are also going to be talking to professionals from across, drawn from housing, health, and social care, sometimes to kind of inform us and educate us about what is practice and provision across 3 boroughs, and at other times to join us in this study to highlight issues and to get involved with us in undertaking this research. So this is very briefly what we are intending to do. And then how are we proposing to do it? So we have envisaged this as an engaged research at all stages. And this application that went in and was successful, that went into Dunhill Medical Trust and is funded by them, was successful because of its multidisciplinary. It was expected to be a co-produced application. And as you can see, this collaboration, this research partnership has not started now. It started a year ago in 2021 when we all sat together and worked together, which was Bashir from Bangla Housing Association, Jeremy from Housing Lynn, who are also one of our partners, and then Professor Sheila Peace and Dr. Caroline Holland and myself from the Open University. So this entire proposal and package has been put together by all of us. And what we have envisaged is that we are going to have 2 groups working with us throughout the project. And whilst I've tried to show that this project is not a linear, the idea of showing it as a flow, as a movement, as an emergent one where things are going to happen as people join us, it is also a way of showing co-creation and co-production happening across the project. And so we have a Bangla Research Advisory Group who will join us very soon. We have ethics now, and at the same time, we'll have a professional advisory group, and we'll also be employing community co-researchers. And the idea is that we create legacies of people from this project, of products, of reports, of concepts, new ideas, and networks of relationships in the local community as well as with professionals. So what Bashir is going to speak next and is going to talk about the role of BRAG and community co-researchers and how they enter into this picture. Over to you, Bashir.
Okay, thank you very much, Manik. Before I talk about how Bangla Housing Association got involved in this project and why you got involved, I'd like to say a little bit about Bangla Housing Association. Well, Bangla Housing Association is a small DME housing association which is based in Hackney in East London, and it was established in 1991. In fact, we celebrated our 30th anniversary last year. And in addition to managing housing, developing housing, looking after housing, social housing, our the work we do, we work very much with the community by actively supporting and engaging the community, by partnering with other local agencies and delivering community development projects, helping to improve people's skills, health and living standards, and maximizing household income. And just to give you a bit of example, the sort of work we do is providing healthy living workshops, workshops on how to manage and live with long-term illnesses like diabetes, hypertension, and other long-term illnesses. We also have been facilitating and organizing language and literacy classes for people from the local community. So we've been doing a lot of work over the past 30 years, engaging the community, working for the community, and that's where we are coming from. With regards to the COVID-19 Advice Project, what what happened here is following the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic during March and June 2020, it became apparent that the Bangladeshi community, particularly the elderly people in our community, were disproportionately impacted, being 2 to 3 times more likely to have been hospitalized or face death compared to the white community. This is a real fact. So using our knowledge of the community and our network of contacts with the community and the statutory organizations, and after securing a grant from the National Lottery, we set up and successfully delivered the COVID-19 Advice Project, helping the community pandemic. As for the Amar Jibon project, we were very pleased when Manik and her colleagues from the Open University contacted us just over 1 year ago, asking if we would be interested in supporting a research project with the housing needs and developing living environments for the Bangladeshi probin or elders in the UK. And after our initial discussions about this proposed research project, knowing how Bangla Housing Association is going to be involved as the key community organization collaborating with Housing Lean and the Open University leading the research program, I felt that it is exactly what Bangla needed to do as part of the response to the adverse, disproportionate impact of the pandemic Bangladeshi probin community. So following a successful delivery of our award-winning COVID-19 Advice Project during the pandemic, we feel that we have acquired precious knowledge, skills, and the network of contacts within the community and the statutory organizations to help us to mobilize a program of activities for a successful outcome for this timely research project. If I go on to the Bangla Research Advisory Group, just before I go through the slide and explain the how this group is going to work, I'd like to say that although we, Bangla Housing Association, that is, represent the community at a certain level, we do recognize that we are not the community. And therefore, we need to bring in diverse community perspectives in this research to brag right from the start and the community co-researchers as well. So what we are going to have is on this BRAG Research Advisory Group, we are going to have 8 members from the community, and they're going to be men and women. Hopefully, there'll be 4 men and 4 women, coming from the 3 boroughs that we are going to be working in, and that is the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, Newham, and Hackney. And the BRAG is going to be supported by Bangla Housing and the Open University. And they're going to be fully engaged to contribute to the different aspects of the research. And this BRAG also is going to be working with the other group, the Practitioner Advisory Group, or PAG, to disseminate the findings to wider community alongside influencing practice and policy. Moving on to the community co-researchers, again, what I'd like to say is that to be able to fully engage with our probin community, selecting the right community co-researchers and the BRAG members, it is very important to understand the local politics, the family dynamics, the religious and cultural sensitivity, and the diversity of needs and aspirations within the community. So with our experience of over 30 years of working in the community, we feel that we are in a good position to call upon, engage with, and recruit the right people as the project progresses. So here we are proposing that we are going to have 6 people recruited from the community. They're going to be over the age of 18. Again, both they're going to be men and women. And these are going to be paid roles jointly recruited by Bangla Housing and the Open University. They are going to be fully trained in research ethics and interviewing skills by the academic team. And the co-researchers will be undertaking interviews with the Bangladeshi probin in Sylheti, Bengali, and English as required, with support from the research partnership. And I put Sylheti as people will know, if you know the Bangladeshi community will know that majority of the Bangladeshi people living in East London, they speak Sylheti. It's a dialect which is spoken in the northeast of Bangladesh. And most of the people that live in East London speak Sylheti. So it is very important co-researchers are able to communicate Sylheti as well as Bengali, because what we do want to do is make sure that language is not a barrier when it comes to interviewing our probin community. This is in a nutshell how Bangla is going to be involved and what we are proposing. Happy to answer any questions. But as from the point of view of Bangladesh Nation, we are very much looking forward to the project. I think this is a timely project, and we are looking forward to it, the next 3 years. Thank you, Manik, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Bashir. I would just like to say one more thing before I stop and we welcome your questions for the DICE project and for this project, is that the professional practitioner advisory group is going to run alongside the Bangla Research Advisory Group. And we hope that these two groups can come together at some point in time and form a coalition of their own. That is one of the legacies that we envisage from this project. So what I'd like to do today is also offer an invite to people who are working in London, in the Greater London Metropolitan Authority, or in any one of these boroughs, or who have interest, knowledge, expertise, and ideas about what needs to be shifted here from their perspectives. Please do get in touch with us. Thank you, Jerome. Thank you, Bashir.
Thank you very much, Manik and Bashir. Manik, on your last point, is there particular contact details you'd like to share with our members?
I think on the project website, we have a project website on Housing Lynn, and
yes,
I'm sure we have my details there.
The details are there. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm sure Sally has shared the URL with everybody already. Okay, so that's great. So very interesting project that the Housing Lynn is really excited about, and we're looking forward to report on the project as it goes along, and hopefully organize a happy hour in a couple of years to promote the final report. Great. So we're now going to move to the Q&A and discussion part of the program. So we've received a few questions. So if I start maybe with, let me just quickly check. So this is a question for you, Paul, for you, Paul, I believe. So it was from Judy Collins from Greater Manchester Older People's Network, and where she's asking, has there been research into community-led housing schemes? We have a new hub, an LGBTQ community-led scheme, well on its way. So, I mean, as far as I can remember recently, I think the Department for Leveling Up launched a report last year, which was called Those Little Connections. I can't think of another one off the top of my head right now, but Paul, do you know of any other researchers on the subject?
Yeah, I do, yeah. So we focused intentionally on mainstream housing, social inclusion agenda in mainstream housing. And as Judy highlights in her comments, there are other schemes that are more specific to particular identity-based communities. So I'm thinking here of the work of Jewish Care, for example, in relation to extra care, and also the work of Tonic Housing in London, who've created the Bank House on the just on the River Thames. That's independent living housing for people, older people identifying as LGBTQ+. So there are those really important initiatives happening that cater for specific communities. And my colleague, Professor Karen West in the School of Policy Studies at the University of Bristol, is in the middle of a 2-year study looking at co-housing models, community-led housing models, which includes community housing. So, for example, one of the initiatives I know that she's been looking at has been women-led co-housing for women, for older women. So that study is currently happening at the moment. And it'd be great to learn more about what Karen and her team find from that study.
Excellent. Great. So, yeah.
And I'll pass on Jody's, I'll pass on Judy's question and email to Karen as well.
Okay, brilliant. There's also, I know we've got lots of resources on our co-housing for older people topic page, which I will ask Sally to post in the chat box, but I'm sure some of these reports you've mentioned, Paul, are available on that topic page. There was while I'm talking with you, Paul, there was just another specific question about the research. Was there any contributors with dementia that took part in your research? There were.
No, there weren't. There weren't residents living with dementia who took part in the qualitative work across the case 8 sites. It's difficult to fathom from the survey data because we asked about disabilities. And people did indicate disabilities, but we weren't able to deduce what those specific disabilities were. We were able to ask questions about how they impacted on people's daily living, what impairments people experienced, but it's difficult to tease out how many of those people identified as living with dementia, a form of dementia. As I mentioned before, we did hear from a small number of residents across extra care schemes in particular, some exclusionary views expressed towards people with dementia. And I just put out a quote. This is a quote from a resident who's 71 and has disabilities themselves, so they have physical disabilities. And they say, there are some people who should be, yeah, the carers do an excellent job here. I'm not going to argue the fact. They do an excellent job, but these people with dementia, shouldn't be here. They should be in a care home. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So we did encounter that form of social exclusion, similar rhetoric, that those people don't belong here, some oppressive language about talking about people who are invalids, or there are more of those kind of people living here now, implying that somehow detracts from the community within the scheme. So there were lots of examples of that othering and that social exclusion, which I think is a really big challenge for extra care providers to tackle. We did come across some interesting initiatives, though, shared through our stakeholders. So one initiative was the involvement of dementia cafes, or the hosting of dementia cafes within extra care schemes. Yes. Where people from the community, people with dementia and their carers would come into the extra care scheme and use that service, as well as it being available for people living within the scheme. So I think there are some really good practices happening out there in terms of trying to make extra care schemes more dementia friendly. Yeah. But there's still this ongoing issue of othering and exclusion on the basis of dementia.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. Bashir, I had a question from you from Sue Weston. So you mentioned sheltered housing and extra care housing in your presentation, and she was just wondering, does Bangla Housing Association have any extra care housing available? Do you provide extra care housing?
To some sheltered housing, do you mean?
Extra care housing.
No, sorry, the housing that we provide, they're all self-contained. We don't have any sheltered or supported housing.
Okay.
So they're all independent and self-contained units that we provide.
Okay. All right. Thank you. There is, I've got a question from Abdul Ravat there about he says the invisibility of national data for social minority groups means we cannot fully understand the systematic discrimination faced by people from such backgrounds, nor scrutinize if policies and practices designed to level up are working. Does the panel, do any of the panel members have any thoughts on how we can improve data collection? Maybe Manik, would you have a view on this, on data collection?
Thank you, Jerome, and thank you, Abdul. I think you're right, Abdul. There is need for more research, but that research that also informs data in some ways. And interestingly, with our work, what we are finding is that while we do have headlines of housing and high health, we do not really know what next. So we talk about housing aspirations all the time, but we do not know what the housing aspirations are of either the Bangladeshi households or about older people themselves, as well as, I think, the idea of, not treating Bangladeshi people as in East London as one big group. We are talking about 3 generations now: the generation that came, the generation that grew up here, and the generation that's now the 3rd generation. And so on all of those accounts, I know there's some work done by Alison Bowes and colleagues a while ago now on Pakistani households, but it is about getting that, for us, it is about adding that flesh to the bones of this quantitative data that is out there and trying to picture that within the wider housing scenario for older people. Indecent, non-decent housing is an issue wider than minority households. But of course, we need to know what the issue is here with these people so that we can look at the picture in a better way. Sorry, I've just gone on and on, rattled. Hopefully I've answered some of your question.
No, that's very, very interesting. Bashir or Paul, is there anything you'd like to add to this question?
We haven't come across any real data and figures as to the Bangladeshi community. I think there might be, there might be figures around somewhere, but I haven't come to anything specific that I can put my fingers on and talk about it.
Okay. And Paul, you wanted to add something to that? Or?
Sure, yeah, I think that data collection about the demographics of residents is so important. Otherwise, how do you provide a service that meets individual needs of residents and reflects those people's identities and life experiences if you don't know who's there? And I'm thinking particularly in mainstream housing, for example, with invisible disabilities, and also where people may not feel able to come out, for example, as LGBT within those settings. And it's not just about collecting that information, it's about building trust and confidence in residents to be able to collect that information. Trust and confidence from residents about sharing it and knowing that's going to be securely shared, and stored, but also trust and confidence is going to be used in a way that will improve the service. It's not just a tick box exercise, it's going to be used in a meaningful way to make it more inclusive.
Yeah, that's very important. Yeah, very good point. So if I move to another question, there was a question from Sheila Peace, who's from the Open University and is collaborating on the Amar Jibon project as well. So I believe, Paul, you've already, she's got a few questions for you, which I believe you already answered in your presentation. So, she was asking, what were the ways in which you felt you could empower communication between people from minority groups with both the wider resident population and professionals and practitioners who work with them? And how are you encouraging these majority groups to use these podcasts? And also, did you notice differences in experience between minority members where sexuality, gender, ethnicity was a dominant issue, or as you have shown, was intersectionally crucial? Maybe a long question, but
three very important questions. Thank you, Sheila. They're great questions, and certainly questions that we've been mulling over since the end of the project. I'll tackle the first question about powering communication between people from minority groups with a wider resident population. I was thinking about that question. A couple of thoughts sprung to mind based on the findings of the study. I've already touched on the involvement of community groups, or the invitation of community groups within the LIFA schemes. So external groups like the Dementia Cafe I mentioned before, coming into the scheme, using the space, and making it a shared space for both external older people and older people living in the scheme. So I think that's potentially good practice that could be rolled out across different groups that reflect different minority groups and different minority identities. I think one thing we don't know about those kind of initiatives, though, that we do need more research around is how much residents within schemes may actually engage with those kind of initiatives happening within their scheme. Just because it's there doesn't necessarily mean that they access it or make the most of it. So I think that's something to explore further in future research. Communal areas, as we learned from the DIE study, were really critical for everyday social interaction. Not all schemes, particularly older schemes that were formerly sheltered housing, had communal areas. But interestingly, residents sometimes created their own communal areas. So we heard stories about residents using car parks in the summer to get together and socialise, or using the laundry as a regular social space, are not ideal spaces and often not accessible, particularly around physical disabilities, but nonetheless highlights the significance of those social spaces. But the communal areas could also be policed. They could be policed by dominant groups of residents, sometimes described as cliques within schemes. So I think staff have a really critical role in not policing those spaces, but being present within those communal spaces. And by looking at ways, getting to know their residents so they know who does represent a minority identity, and being able to actively respond and look at ways in which they can involve and include residents from minority groups within those spaces, and how and noticing when residents are sometimes excluded from those social spaces. And one of the concerns that we had from the DIE study was that more and more housing providers, mainstream housing providers, are moving to a floating support model, where there often isn't a regular staff member on site, what we might formally talk about as a warden, for example. Some did have administrative people in administrative roles or estates roles who were often present. Those people were really critical because they got to know the residents. They were able to respond when they noticed residents were isolating themselves from others, or perhaps there was some experience of exclusion happening. But we think the danger of moving to this floating model is that you lose that rapport and that relationship that's built, and the trust and confidence is built between residents and staff, and you lose that presence of staff in site who can play a really critical role in making sure that residents and minority groups are fully included and integrated and feel supported to be part of scheme life.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. I think we've gone through all the questions already. seems to have gone very fast, but yeah, I think we've gone through everything. We've got a few minutes left, which is not surprising. It's a slightly shorter agenda than usual today. So I think I'm just going to ask all of our presenters today if there's a final word they would like to say about their project, or a more general message. So Manik, is there anything in particular you'd like to ask or to say?
I'd just like to, well, I think I've said what I wanted to say for today, but I'd like to thank Housing Lane and Bashir for joining in today with this presentation.
Thank you very much, Manik. Yeah, we're looking forward to keep in touch and report on the project, as I said earlier on. Bashir, is there any last message you'd like to pass to our audience?
No, not really. Just to say that our research work, the interviews that we are going to be carrying out, they're going to be mainly residents of social housing, private housing, and generally in mainstream housing. A few people in sheltered housing and care, but there will be only a small number, I think. Obviously, we will go for the cross-section. Yeah. It is important that we get views of who's living in all sorts of housing settings.
Yeah, in different settings. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Just lastly, just to say thank you very much for giving the opportunity to come and speak on this session. Thank you, Jeremy.
It's a pleasure.
And thanks, Paul and Manik.
Great. Thank you very much. Paul, have you got a last message, last word you'd like to say?
Probably got lots of last messages I want to say.
Please
I think one thing I will say is that it's great to see lots of energy and enthusiasm and initiatives around more specific community housing initiatives that are popping up that cater to specific community groups. I think that's fantastic, and it's definitely needed. But I also think it's really important we don't lose focus on the significance of mainstream housing and the need for that to provide a fully inclusive environment, and to kind of ask those critical questions. If it doesn't represent people from minority groups who we know live in the local community and live in the local geographical area, then why is that not the case? And we often know that older people who move into those schemes, for example, social housing, often have little choices in their local area about what schemes are available to them, particularly if they're supported through their local authority. So that makes it even more important to keep a clear focus on mainstream housing, as well as learning more about community-specific initiatives and the role that they can play.
Excellent.
And thank you, my co-presenters. I really look forward to following this study and learning more about their findings when they come through.
Great. So yeah, thank you all again. That was a really interesting session. So for our audience, I just would like to remind you to please complete the survey at the end of this session. That will be really helpful for us to devise on the next series of Happy Hour. So while I'm talking about the next series, so let's go back to the current series of Happy Hour, which is available on the forthcoming events page of our website. So you will see we've got a long list of events happening in May and in June, and we're preparing now the summer series, so that we shared with you very soon. But the first Happy Hour of the series starting next week is next Tuesday. You can join us at our Happy Hour, which where we'll be discussing the London School of Economics research, which was commissioned by the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, on the effectiveness of community-led housing, especially co-housing, in reducing loneliness across all ages. So this will be a really nice follow-up to today's session. And so as you can see as well on screen, so if you'd like to talk to the Housing Link about any matters highlighted in this week's happy hour, share learning about your work and or discuss how our consultancy services can support you, please get in touch. So you've got all the contact details here. You know where to reach us. Yeah. And lastly, please remember to fill the survey. That would be really helpful. Great. Thank you again to all our speakers today. Thank you, Sally, for your contribution in the chat box. And great. Looking forward to seeing you all very soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Bye, everyone. Bye.